Okay, last chapter, everybody. I'm sure you're sad that this semester is coming to an end. Um, so this is all about animal behavior. This is related to ecology, but it kind of takes a different direction. I hope you enjoy it. I think it's pretty interesting. So what are we talking about? We're talking about behavioral ecology. So this is simply the set of actions that an animal can perform as it interacts with stimuli in its environment. So, in other words, every animal displays behavior, and that behavior can be anywhere on a spectrum of complexity. So, humans display really complex behavior. You know, we sing songs, we drive cars, we make memes, we laugh at memes, we read books. But animals display some pretty complex behavior too. Birds migrate, bees communicate by dancing. Um, um, cheetahs hunt antelope, earthworms eat dirt, insects fly around and know how to overwinter. So there's lots of different behaviors that animals display. And so this chapter is an attempt to kind of look at behaviors and try to figure out what's going on, what causes them, and why they happen, and how they happen. Um, so every animal has some behaviors that they do. Um, and they respond to certain stimuli while they ignore other stimuli. So, what's going on here? Why do they do this? That's the question we're going to be asking. So, all behaviors also have a cost to them and they have a benefit to them. So, for example, if a bird migrates, that has a cost. It takes a lot of energy to migrate. You run risks as you venture out into territory you've never been before, as you try to find your way migrating over long distances or over an ocean. But migrating also has benefits. So you might be able to find mates or find more food or find a place to overwinter. And so what's true for migration is true for all behaviors. It's true for singing, for example. So we've got 3 different bird species on this slide, and they all sing a unique song. And so, what are the benefits of these? So males will sing to attract females, but what benefits do females get from paying attention to the song and from responding to the song? So, deciding to mate with a male or move to his territory because of the quality of his song. There's costs to singing, so you might attract predators, or it requires pretty complex brain structure and vocal cords. You spend a lot of energy and time singing. So anyway, there's costs and benefits to behaviors. So from an evolutionary perspective, all of the behaviors that animals display have basically been shaped by natural selection. And so while they have costs, the benefits outweigh the costs. So ethology is a discipline of science that focuses on how evolutionary processes shape behaviors and the ways that animals respond to specific stimuli. So, in other words, it asks questions like, well, what triggers a specific behavioral response? So, what triggers birds to migrate? How do they know when to do it? How do they know where to fly? It looks at how does the expression of a behavior develop as an animal matures. So, were birds born with an instinct to migrate? Do they know where they're going? Do they remember it genetically, or do they learn it? Do they do it by following other birds of their same species? What is the behavior's ecological function? How does it increase its chance of surviving and reproducing? So again, how does migration help a bird survive? Why is migrating better than not migrating? And another question could be, how did the behavior evolve? So how did migration evolve? Did it evolve with one bird, with a population of birds? Is it something they inherited from dinosaurs? What's going on? So as scientists practice ethology, they will often analyze behavior according to 2 categories: proximate causes and ultimate causes. Proximate causes of behavior focus on how the behavior happens. So if you're trying to figure out how a behavior happens, you're going to be looking at things like the genetic blueprint that provides information to the body on how to respond to stimuli. You might be looking at cellular clues. So, what's going on in the cells and the tissues, or the physiology or the anatomy, that allow them to detect whatever stimulus is affecting their behavior, and how do they respond to it. Compare those analyses with ultimate causes. These are questions of why. So why do the genetic and the physiological mechanisms that underlie behaviors, how is natural selection selected for them? Um, what, man, whoa. Ooh, okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. My daughter is sick. She's okay. So ultimate causes are why. So why did it evolve? Why do they do this? So proximate is how, ultimate is why. Okay, when it comes to behavior, there's long been a debate among scientists as to whether animals are born with their behaviors. So in other words, do they just download it from their parents, or do they learn it? Right. So in human circles, maybe the nature versus nurture debate. So nature would be, is this just natural? This comes with the territory of being a human, or is it um, what did I say? Nature versus nurture, or is it nurtured? In other words, is it learned? Did you pick it up from culture, or from your society, or from your parents, or from your belief system? So the two categories that we'll use to separate behavior is instinctive behaviors and learned behaviors. So these tables are pretty helpful because they classify different types of behavior according to whether they're instinctive or learned. So if you look at the table on the left, for example, these are some examples of the instinctive behaviors, and we'll talk about some of these in a moment. So these are all behaviors that are instinctive, meaning that they have a strong genetic basis. In other words, an animal is more or less born with these behaviors. So fixed action patterns are instinctive. We'll talk about that in just a second. Feeding behaviors, so hunting, or for an eagle to catch a fish that's swimming in the river, or for a honeybee to fly towards a colorful flower. These are innate food preferences and tactics that they're born with. They don't have to learn it. Defensive behaviors, so running from a predator, for example. Reproductive behaviors, so um, taking care of offspring through parental care, or mating habits. These are all instinctive, so they're more or less born with them. Compare those with learned behaviors. So learned behaviors are things like imprinting and classical and operant conditioning, cognition, habituation. So we'll talk about all these in turn, but basically these are behaviors that are learned, so that they can be shaped by experience, or they can be learned from other members of the population or other members of the species, or maybe even behaviors that are learned from watching other species. So while we have these two categories of instinctive and learned, it turns out that most behaviors are a mix of both. So a lot of times there's an instinctive genetic basis for behavior, and then animals learn in order to modify that behavior, or learn when to implement that behavior, or learn when to not implement that behavior. So in humans, for example, it's instinctive to maybe cry when you're injured, right? So that's something that you didn't learn from watching other people that are hurt. So if you were a little baby and something poked you, you would cry. So it's instinctive. But over time, you might also learn to cry. So you might see your favorite boy band come on the stage and you might start crying. So that's not necessarily an instinctive response. That might be a learned response from watching other people cry. I'm talking about you, Landon. So genetics and experience both contribute to behavior. Um, so bird song is something that's been studied pretty extensively because it's really nice. With birds display behavior, they can sing songs. Not every bird of the same species sings a song exactly the same. They can all put their own little twist on it. There's different dialects for songs. Um, and the songs are both genetic and learned. So there's a genetic disposition to sing, and there's also a learned component, so they can learn how to sing from listening to other members of their species. So the book talks about a really interesting example, for example, with some birds called white crowns. And so basically, this researcher would take newly hatched birds from nests in the wild, and then he would rear them alone in soundproof cages. So some of the chicks, he would play the recordings I called these white crowns. They're white crowned sparrows, my bad. So for some of these chicks, he would play recordings of male white crowned sparrows singing their song. And others, he would not play them any songs at all. And then he waited to see what happened. And so it turns out that that in both cases the birds started to sing a song. They started to vocalize when they were about 150 days old. But gradually, the males that had been listening to their species' song began to sing better and better. And eventually, after about another 50 days or so, they were right on target. They could sing the song note for note, and you couldn't really tell a difference between their song and the song that they had been played on the tape. But in contrast, the males that had never heard the white-crowned sparrow songs before, they never sang in the way that the wild males did. So the singing behavior is instinctive, it's innate, but the actual song, the pattern of the song and the notes and the rhythm, that is learned behavior. That's pretty interesting. Okay, let's look at some instinctive behaviors. So these are behaviors that are performed without prior experience. They're not learned, so they're basically born with this behavior programmed into their genome. So the first example is fixed action patterns. So fixed action patterns are just instinctive behaviors that are stereotyped. And what that means is that there's a specific cue or stimulus that triggers a series of actions that, as long as that stimulus is there, it's always going to trigger those actions. So it's kind of like an automated response, like a series of behaviors or actions that are linked together in response to a specific stimuli. So look at the example on the screen. This is a female goose. She's on her nest, sitting on some eggs, and she sees an egg outside of the nest. So she'll get up. Once she sees it, that serves as the stimulus. It causes her to stand up. It causes her to then place her beak over the egg, and then it causes her to roll the egg back into the nest. Now what's interesting is you can manipulate this instinctive behavior because there's not really cognition going on. They're just seeing the egg and it triggers these behaviors and they do it. So a researcher can keep putting an egg there over and over, and each time she doesn't say, the researcher's putting an egg, I only laid 5 eggs, this would make a 6th egg, that's not mine, I'm not going to worry about it. No, every time the researcher puts an egg there, it's going to trigger this fixed action potential. She's going to stand up and roll it back into her nest. All right, so fixed action patterns are triggered by something called a sign stimuli. All right, so for example, here in this picture, this is a cowbird. So it's a bird that's actually a parasite. And this is, I don't know, a normal bird. And what happens is the mama cowbird comes in and waits until this mama bird is off of her nest, and the cowbird lays an egg in the nest, and her egg hatches first, and the baby cowbird pushes all the other eggs out of the nest, basically murders the other birds. And when the mom comes back, she sees this bird in her nest, this baby in her nest, and the baby opens its mouth and she sees the orange portion of its mouth, and it triggers a fixed action potential. So the open mouth serves as a sign stimuli, and it triggers a fixed action potential where she drops food into its open jaws. So this is an example of a situation where a parasite, the cowbird, can take advantage of a fixed action potential. It's basically like inserting itself into the sequence and knowing that it's going to get a benefit. It's going to get fed by the bird even though it's not its offspring. Another example is here. This is with some gulls, herring gulls. And so when a mama herring gull comes in, she's got food in her mouth, and the baby birds see her, and when they see this red dot on her bill, that serves as the sign stimuli, and they open their mouth, and it causes her to drop the food into their mouth. So researchers can make a puppet, and when they make a puppet, if they put a red dot on it, as soon as the young see the red dot, they open their mouths. Now, not as much, but they still do. So in other words, they're paying attention to this red dot. Then if the researchers grab the mother herring gull and they paint over the red dot, when she comes to the nest, the young birds don't see a red dot, and so they don't open their mouth as much, and so they don't get fed as much. So again, this is just another example of how a sign stimuli triggers behavior. Another interesting example is with garter snakes and banana slugs. So here's a banana slug. So you find it on the coast of California. And then the garter snake lives in two areas. So it lives in the coast, and then there's a subpopulation that lives in the mountains. So the ones on the coast are used to interacting with banana slugs and eating them, but the ones that live inland, they're not used to seeing banana slugs because banana slugs aren't around. And so in this research, what they did was they rubbed a cotton swab on a banana slug, and then they waved the cotton swab in front of baby snakes that were reared in a lab, that were descended from coastal garter snakes. And those, when they smelled the cotton swab with the banana slug juices on it, they would open their mouth and flick their tongue, and they would even try to take bites out of it. But the ones that were the snakes that were captured from inland, where there aren't banana slugs, when they were exposed to the cotton swab with the banana slug smells, they didn't open their mouth or flick their tongue. So there is a genetic component to this feeding behavior. So what the researcher did to test this hypothesis that it was a genetic component was he crossbred the coastal snakes with the inland snakes. And their offspring, which were hybrids of these two populations, he showed them banana slugs and banana slug soaked cotton swabs, and they reacted in a way that was about halfway between the coastal and the inland garter snake populations. In other words, they had the hybrid snakes had mixed parentage, and they consumed the banana slugs more frequently than we would expect if there wasn't a genetic component going on. So let's talk about those are all instinctive behaviors. So you can see that sometimes learned behaviors like eating banana slugs can become genetics. In other words, feeding preferences can affect alleles and can affect how natural selection keeps those alleles in a population. Let's look at learned behaviors. So learning is a process in which experiences change an animal's behavioral responses. So in other words, they have experienced something in the world, and that experience causes them to act in a way that they would not act if they hadn't experienced that. So it turns out that for a lot of learned behaviors, there's a critical period in which learning behavior needs to be established. So the critical period is a time-limited phase of early development. So you can see that in this graph. So the ease of learning something kind of peaks usually at an early age, and then it declines with age. So maybe you've heard the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's because an old dog is older, right? So it's outside this window of critical learning period, and so it's harder for it to learn something. Or maybe you've heard that human kids can learn a language really quickly if they take language classes or exposed to another language when they're young, but it's harder to pick up a language when you're old. It's the same thing. Imprinting is basically when learning happens in that critical period. So a famous example of this is when ducks and geese first hatch. They have a critical period early on where they can imprint. In other words, what do you call it? They can sorry, I'm going blank here. They can basically they'll start following as a parent figure the first animal they see. And now in the wild, normally the first animal they see is going to be their mom, right? So they'll imprint and they'll say, hey, this is my mom, and they'll follow around. And if they're good ducks, they'll listen to what she says. But this guy, his name's Konrad Lorenz, so he's a famous animal behaviorist or ethologist. And he had some geese that when they hatched, he took the mother away, and he was hanging around the nest. And so what happened is they thought he was their mom. So they would follow him around. He could walk around the property and go swimming like you see in the picture, and these ducks would do whatever he did. Later on, when they reached sexual maturity, the ducks would even try to court and mate with humans. So in other words, that the fact that they were imprinted during that critical learning period changed their behavior, and they learned that humans are a parent figure. Another example of learned behavior is classical conditioning, also called Pavlovian conditioning. And this is a famous experiment that you've probably heard of. So Pavlov took some dogs and he put them in cages, and he found, I mean, everyone knows that when you show a dog a bowl of food, it's going to get excited and it's going to start salivating as it's anticipating its next meal. So we would call that an unconditioned stimulus. So in other words, they didn't learn to salivate when they see food or smell food. They just do it. It's totally natural. So what Pavlov did was right before he would bring him the food, or when he brought him the food, he would ring a bell. And so when he rings the bell and brings the food, the dog salivates. Initially, when he would bring, I'm sorry, I did this out of order, didn't I? So he would ring a bell. Let me back up. He would ring a bell and the dog wouldn't respond. So there's no salivation, right? So the stimulus of ringing a bell, the dog didn't really care. All right. And then over time, when he brought him the food, he would ring the bell. And so over time, the dogs started to associate the ringing of a bell with food. And eventually he could just ring a bell and not bring them food, and they would salivate. So basically he would take a stimulus and he would condition it. He would say, look, normally you wouldn't respond to a bell ringing, but I can train you to respond to a bell ringing so that every time you hear a bell ringing, you salivate. So this is a learned response, and it just shows how learned behavior can modify innate behavior or instinctual behavior. So in other words, hearing a bell can cause you to salivate and can cause the instinctive behavior of salivating to occur because you're anticipating food and you associate that with the ringing of a bell. Operant conditioning is another type of learned behavior where animals learn to link a voluntary activity with its favorable consequences. So sometimes operant conditioning is called punishment and reward. And basically this is how we train kids, right? So we don't ring a bell when we feed our kids, but we do say something like, hey, you were quiet in church, so you get a piece of candy after church. So that's a reward. So that's reinforcing the behavior that we want the child to display. Right? And likewise, if the child acts up during church and is loud and is distracting or whatever, then we say, well, when you get home, you have to do some chores. So there you're providing a punishment, you're providing some sort of consequence for behavior. And so by rewarding good behaviors, you're hoping to increase that behavior. And by punishing bad behaviors, you're trying to decrease that behavior. So we can do this with animals as well. So the book gives several examples, like they put rats in a cage where there's a bar, and if you push the bar, it gives them some food. And so they learn that pushing this bar gives them food, so they're more likely to spend a large portion of their day pushing a bar, hoping to get a reward. In other experiments, which were decidedly more mean, they had it where if a rat pushed the bar, it would get an electrical shock, so that served as a punishment. So over time, you could hardly get the rats to push a bar at all because they were afraid of getting zapped. And so there you decrease the behavior through experience. Some animals display cognition. So cognition is thinking up a solution to a problem, right? So like trial and error attempts to solve a problem. So a famous example of this is with ravens. And so here they have there's a raven, and they give it a string, or they tie a string to this stick, and at the other end of the string is some food. And so the raven can't get the food because it's hanging from the string, but the raven is able to display cognition. And what it would do is it would pull up the string with its beak and then stomp on it with its foot, pull up some more string with its beak, stomp on it with its foot, and it would keep doing that until eventually the food was in reach and it could get a snack. So that shows that the raven had a problem. It wanted some food, but it couldn't reach it, and so it used cognition to solve the problem. So some animals are capable of conquering some pretty challenging scenarios. They've done similar experiments with elephants and dolphins and animals that we would consider to have pretty advanced cognition. Habituation is the learned loss of responsiveness. So imagine a baby bird in its nest, and it's waiting for its mom to return with some food in her beak, and they see a shadow pass overhead. And the shadow is from a cloud, but maybe the baby bird thinks, oh, this is mom coming back to give me a snack. And so they open their mouths and they say, feed me, feed me, feed me. But they don't get fed, right? Because it was just a cloud. Then another cloud passes by, and maybe they do it again, but not quite as much. And then another cloud and another cloud. And after a while, they stop responding to shadows passing overhead. So they've learned, you know what, this isn't getting me anywhere, so I'm going to stop doing this behavior. And there's plenty of other examples that we could talk about. So to use an example from humans, right? So there's a parenting technique. I forget the name of it. We didn't do it, but we had friends that did, where when a baby is crying, you just let it cry. So you've got a 6-month-old baby, you put it down in its crib, and it wants to be held or it wants to nurse or whatever, and you just ignore it. And so after a while, so at first it'll cry and cry and cry, but when it learns that crying won't bring you back to the room, it stops crying. So parents will use this technique to make sure that their baby, doesn't cry and goes to sleep and doesn't wake up all night. We didn't do that, but some people do. So that's habituation. All right, migration. So let's talk about some specific behaviors that animals do. One is migration. So migration is traveling from an area in which they were born to a distant and unfamiliar destination, and then returning to their birth site later on. So birds do this. So in the slide or in the picture, you can see an Arctic tern. So it's born in northern Canada, and then it makes a round trip journey where it flies all the way to the South Pacific near Antarctica, and then it returns to northern Canada. So that's a pretty big deal. 70,000 kilometers, according to the book. Okay, so lots of animals migrate. So how do they do this? So how does an Arctic tern know to go south? How does it find Antarctica? How does it know when to stop? How does it know when to leave? How does it know when to return? So there are three mechanisms for migration: piloting, compass orientation, and navigation. So the first one, piloting, is where animals use landmarks to guide their journey. So for example, gray whales will migrate from Alaska to the southern coast of California and back, and they do that by swimming close to the coastline and looking for landmarks. So when they see particular landmarks in Southern California, they know it's time to stop. So if you were to move the whales further off the coast so they couldn't see the coastline, then they wouldn't know where to go or how to migrate. So piloting is pretty simple, but you can be tricked. So if the landscape changes, like if maybe one of your piloting landmarks is a particular tree, but if that tree falls over, then you're out of luck, right? So just like when you're in a new town, and if you always knew to turn right at the gas station, but then one day they knock the gas station down, you might get confused. Anyway, that's piloting. Compass orientation is a little bit more sophisticated. Here, animals move in a particular direction over a specific distance for a prescribed length of time. So it's kind of, if you've ever, done orienteering, maybe you haven't. If you were a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, what you can do is go out in the woods with a compass, and you can say, okay, I'm going to go east for half a kilometer, and then I'm going to go south for a kilometer, and then I'm going to go west for 2 kilometers, and then that's going to get me to my destination. Compass orientation is doing that in migration. So they might fly south and know that they need to fly south for a certain number of hours or days or for a certain distance. So usually in order to do compass orientation, they need some sort of internal clock where they can use something as a compass and they know what time of the year it is. So maybe a bird would fly in a direction relative, they don't have compasses, right? So they would fly in a direction relative to the sun, and they know that they need to fly, they need to leave at a certain time of the year when the sun is at a certain place in the sky, and then when the sun is at a different place in the sky, they know it's time to return. Navigation is the most complicated wayfinding mechanism. And in navigation, an animal moves towards a specific destination. And they do it using both compass orientation and a mental map of where they're going. All right. And so in navigation, um, they might they might make a trip, make a migration, and they pay attention to landmarks and they use compass orientation, and then they're able to combine both of those, all of that data, and create a mental map. So they're saying, okay, well, I know where I'm going, but you know what? I'm going to stop and eat some food. There's a nice bird feeder down here. I'm going to get a snack, and then when I take off, I'm going to know where to go. So even if I spend a day here or 2 days, I can pick up where I left off. There's been some interesting experiments done involving migration. So they took indigo buntings and they put them in in cone-shaped test cages, and then they put paper on these cages and put ink pads on the bottom. And what they did was they kept these cages outdoors, and they just saw the where the birds walked around. And so the so you can see in this example, right, the footprints for this. Sorry, I'm distracted. I was playing with this squeeze toy, and it just exploded pink stuff. It was full of like this pink coloring, and it just exploded all over me. Hold up. I'm back. I'm okay. So here you can see that this indigo bunting like kept trying to go northeast, right? We can tell by its footprint. So it was walking around on the paper, touching ink pads, and it's like, oh, this thing wants to go northeast. And it turns out that if you keep these things in these cages, in autumn they try to go southeast, and in spring it tries to go north. And on cloudy nights, they just kind of randomly walked around. So we learn a couple of things here. One, they know what direction it is. They know at a certain time of the year they need to be going in a particular direction, either south or north. And then on the cloudy nights, the fact that they walked around randomly shows that since they were moving around randomly, it means that the clouds were maybe obscuring the stars, and so maybe they can tell the direction not by some sort of internal compass, but they're navigating based on patterns of stars in the sky. Pretty cool. And then here's a really cool example of migration. This is monarch butterflies. So monarch butterflies perform a multi-generational migration. And I don't know why it's so blurry, but this is where the monarch butterflies live in the summer. So pretty much all of North America. And actually there's two populations. There's a western population and a eastern population. So the Rocky Mountains divide the two populations. So in the winter, the western population migrates to California to overwinter, and the eastern population migrates to Mexico, and they live in these certain sections of the forest where there's billions and billions of them overwintering on trees. And what's cool is it's not like a bird where just one individual flies south and then comes back, or a whale that does the same thing. These monarchs will fly. Let's say a monarch is in Maine, so it'll fly, but they don't live that long, so maybe it flies to Vermont, and in Vermont it lays some eggs and then it dies. And then its eggs hatch, and then the larvae develop, the caterpillars develop, and then the adults fly a little farther south, and maybe they get to, I don't know, Tennessee. And then the adults die, but they lay eggs, and then the eggs hatch, and then new monarchs are born, and then they fly south, and so on and so forth. So it's multi-generational. So each generation picks up where the last generation left off. So that's pretty complicated, and it's pretty impressive that the butterflies can do this. So it takes 2 to 5 generations for them to make this migration. Pretty cool. All right, that wraps up part 1. Oh, no, it doesn't. Just kidding. I forgot. When it comes to movement, there's 2 categories of movement. There's kinesis and taxis. And so taxis kind of looks like taxis, but it's taxis. So kinesis is an increase in random movement. So in other words, in kinesis, an animal will change the rate of movement or the frequency of turning in response to a stimulus. So for example, this is a pill bug, and so the pill bug wants to live under a rock or in places where it's dark and damp. And so what happens is when they encounter dry soil, then they start undergoing kinesis. So it's dry and they start scrambling around and moving. And so they turn really frequently. But then when they hit a patch where it's moist soil, then they move less. They start going in more or less a straight line. So in other words, kinesis is just a type of movement that allows an animal to get out of a bad situation and to find a habitat that's better suited for them. In taxis, we have animals that are moving either towards or away from a specific stimulus. So for example, cockroaches have negative phototaxis. So if you shine a light on a cockroach, then it wants to avoid that light and it will seek darkness. So it will move directly away from the light and move towards an area that is darker, right? Plants can even do taxis. So a plant's flowers might move towards and open up towards the sun, and very slowly it might actually move towards the sun's rays, and as it gets dark, the flower might curl up and it might move back into the shade. So two types of movement. So we find that the movement and the choice of habitats that animals display is adaptive, and it's been shaped by natural selection. So scientists did a really cool experiment with birds. And so the blue tit is a bird that likes to live in oak forests. And so when they look at the preferences of the habitat selection by the wild birds, they found that most of the time they preferred oak forests. So sometimes they live in the pines, but they preferred oak. And if they reared them in captivity and then released them, they found that they still had that preference. So it wasn't as strong, but they still had a preference for oak forests. And then with the coal tits, these things are the opposite. So they find the wild type prefer pine forests, and when they rear them in a lab and then release them into the wild, they still prefer pine forests, but not quite as much. So there's a mix of instinctive gene-based behavior here, right? This isn't learned behavior. And that natural selection has basically acted on these two different species to prefer a particular habitat. And by the way, Princess Bride, one of the best childhood movies of all time. Great film. Great film. Now we're really done. One more video and we're done.